Black country, England's engine room and soul.
Having a discussion on geopoetics in England, and two speakers, Dr. Rob Francis and Alyson Hallett. And my name is Patrick, so I'm Assistant Director.
Dr. Alyson Hallett, Pat, come on.
I'm sorry, Dr. Alyson Hallett. So we got two doctors to tell us about geopoetics in England today. And as you can tell from my accent, I'm in Edinburgh, but I'm an English person born and bred. So we look forward to this discussion. And we're going to start, the way this will work is that Rob will talk for 15-20 minutes, and then we'll follow with Alyson, and then we'll have some general discussion at the end. So with that, I want to hand over to Rob. Rob is a lecturer at the University of Wolverhampton. He's been a visiting poet, to a geological society. He was visiting the Black Country Geological Society, poet in residence. So he's worked in both camps. So over to you, Rob.
Thank you very much, Pat, and thank you to Norrie and the rest of the team. It's really lovely to be here, and huge thanks for such a massive turnout from people as well. I really appreciate people tuning in, and I'll just bring my slides up. There we go. Hopefully that'll bring it up on a large screen now. Can I just get a thumbs up from Norrie or Pat to say people can see that? Lovely.
That's
okay.
Good.
So I'll get going then straight away, I think. So geopoetics, for me at least, and for other thinkers as well, is about crossing points. And the Canadian poet Don Mackay called geopoetics a crossing point between science and rationalism and the mystical and the poetic. And for me, I think it's about forging new modes of meaning making. I think new expressions of meaning making. And as Norrie has said in previous talks and writings, geopoetics concerns itself with expressing the earth, and it's not depicting the earth or portraying the earth, it's expressing the natural charge of the earth. And I think in order to kind of encapsulate that in some sense, it needs to be both logical and data driven in some sense, and scientific and rational, but also to be visceral and charged and from the gut. So the crossing points here are the crossing points of science and mysticism, of rationality and instinct, of cognition or computation, and that of the senses and the feelings, the crossing points between being and landscape, and indeed the way that being and landscape clash and connect in interesting ways. And all of this kind of brings about what I think are these sort of threshold positions of mindscape and landscape, as Kenneth White might say. And we enter this kind of gateway, this threshold, this liminal landscape, which is ripe for reconfiguring, revitalizing, and transforming. And this is what I've tried to do, I guess, in this first poem that I'd like to share with you today, which is a poem called Coccolithophore, beautiful little phytoplankton organism, and you can see the beautiful image of the Coccolithophore here as well. In chain coral coders, she crystallized convex plates with polysaccharides. Her fearless radial symmetries burn bright in sheer geometries, raise white cliffs in pelagite spew, colors the reef and mesh of foods, clean solute with light, gases the wreck in choral ashe arabesques. Father-daughter bring tip to tongue from another humanless and long fieldwork drift to Shire Oak Bar, tasting salt-driven wyvern's scar. Call her Emiliani, Huxley, Coccolithophore, nothing so huge has ever been so small. Thank you very much. And hopefully you can hear in that the sort of mix of the different vernaculars and the different types of observation or method to bring out that that dual sword, or the crossing point, as I mentioned. One of the touchstones in my creative practice and in my scholarly practice is a preoccupation really with environmental psychology, and in particular Harold Prashansky's idea of place identity. And this idea comes about the fact that we're sort of from places, and we grow up in places, and we move across places, and in doing so we kind of pick up little bits and we put down little bits, and we attach ourselves and distance ourselves respectively from things that we're attracted to or repulsed by. And places are more than just dots on the map. They're these dynamic, incredible things full of smell and memory and family and friendship groups, and even boring stuff like bus routes and decent schools and nice places to shop and leisure facilities. But then more in bigger, wilder things like iconic sporting feats and engineering feats and industrial discoveries, and all these things kind of layer upon layer and web around themselves, and we kind of imbibe that onto our sense of self. Twigler-Ross and Ouzel, in their quantitative study, think about identity as a biological organism, which of course we are, moving across time. And you might also say moving across landscape, because that's a fundamental of our beingness as mammals. And on a cellular level, we are beings moving across landscape. And our identities develop through the accommodation, assimilation, and evaluation of the social world. So all of this is kind of brought together to sort of consider the ways in which place and people, on an individual level and on a communal level, interact, clash and connect. And I think this is vital to geopoetics, because geopoetics' drive, its impulse, is to reconfigure the local, reconfigure our awareness of our local environments, and the building blocks and the shifts of those building blocks that enabled those communities and cultures to exist. The geology, in fact. Another touchstone for my creative and academic work is psychogeography, and what later got termed deep topography. And again, I think this links quite nicely with developments in geopoetics as well. So the psychogeographers came about in the sort of 50s and 60s under the banner of the Situationist Internationale, and they were concerned with the urban environment predominantly, and concerned with the ways in which the urban environment might be a manifestation of kind of capitalist imprisonment. They were a bunch of what Will Self called pretentious Marxists, who were worried that the landscapers of the urban environment, the politicians, the governments and whatnot, were attempting to kind of keep us blinkered, keep us in a kind of commercial and capitalist state of mind, I suppose. And even if you don't subscribe to that Marxist ideology, which I certainly don't, there is something to be said, I think, about the way in which we travel the same routes every day, by the same means every day, the same distances every day. And that kind of keeps us blinkered in some sense. And I think, again, this is in keeping with the geopoetic impulse, and certainly shares some of the ideas that Norrie has shared with us in his work and in his talks, about leaving the highway of Western thought, leaving the highway of Western civilization. And so geopoetics comes about in a similar vein. Now, the psychogeographers were interested in drift or derive, and this whole idea was that they would aimlessly ramble, they would aimlessly walk around and deliberately get lost in their urban environments as a way of kind of unlocking the spell that the systems in place struck us with. And in doing so, we unlock it, see things on our own terms, see things from our own instincts and our own idiosyncratic viewpoints. So again, this kind of impulse-driven unlocking and revitalizing and reconfiguring of our immediate locales is in keeping with quite a lot of the things that Kenneth White has said, and other geopoetic practitioners. I remember from a conference paper that White gave in Portugal. He said people know their address, but they don't know where they live. Michel de Certeau said that this kind of derive, this kind of unlocking of our locales, unlocks this kind of bewitching, possessed feeling, and we start to see our locales as a text, or indeed as a map, and we start to read or reread the environment with a solar eye, looking down like a god. So we rip off the kind of mind-forged manacles, to use a Blakean idea, and we become these kind of Promethean figures that can start to wayfind in new ways. And I've kind of taken this and sort of harnessed it with a sort of lay understanding, a lay experiment with the earth sciences and geology in the Black Country Geopark as poet in residence for the Black Country Geological Society. The UNESCO Black Country Geopark is a series of about 48 plus sites that are scattered across Wolverhampton, Walsall, Sandwell and Dudley and those boroughs. And they're sites of great geological wonder, Silurian bedrocks and beautiful outcrops and ripple beds and all sorts of real wonders that you can touch and feel and sense in that geopoetic way. But they're also sites of industrial heritage as well. So if you know where to look in these sites, there are the remnants of bell pits and mines and train tracks, and where we dug into the earth and used its geology as a resource. But they're also sites of protected species of flora and fauna and bird and insect life, and they're lush, rich havens of wildlife and beautiful green spaces. But more than this as well, these are sites, and you can see on the image on the left here, the housing estate in the background. This is typical of the Black Country Geopark. You walk through a Dudley Council estate, down a little alley, through a little gate, and suddenly you're in this new zone. You're in deep time, you're in slow time, you're in this beautiful lush haven that's full of these layers and layers of place identity. And likewise, you can walk through an industrial estate and down into its geology underneath, and all of these things become acutely intermingled, and we see it on a gut level as much as we do when we kind of read and learn about it a little bit as well. So all of these things kind of fuse together, the geology, the different aspects of place identity, the drifting, my own feelings mingled with my own reading, mingled with my own poetic impulses, and the meeting place of different types of language and different observation methods and truth-seeking methods all coagulate, form solutions that are kind of bigger than the sum of their parts, or I at least attempt to. And this is where the kind of geopoetic meaning comes from, in those sparks that fly off in the liminal. And this is what I'm hoping to play around with a little bit in this poem called Coalescence. Just spring, the last leaves left from autumn's mulching leak into pig iron grounds, grey whack, fire clay, ironstone, sit turbid at Netherton Spa, where dog walkers and rambling clubs and pinfold teens and locked-in pensioners sense the spectral gravity beneath feet. It seems to whine at the fly-tipped waist. It takes it into itself. And the buds from bramble damson wipe room from eyes between quick flash of bluebell, snowdrop. Room drips in Dalton caverns as in weeping elms and human pores. This land leaves them colloidal. We suspend. Thank you. And the last few slides that I want to share with you really are just kind of touch points really, and thinking points, I guess, for future discussion, and also to show you some really nice photos of the Black Country Geopark. So this first one is of Fens Pool that sits between Dudley and Brierley Hill, and again, it's framed by two large housing estates. It's right on the edge of the kind of industrial heartland that's still that part of the Black Country. But it's also this beautiful wetland of migratory birds and wonderful species, and home to both kind of nefarious and clandestine behaviours, as well as ecological behaviour as well. And I think this is a nice image to think about the kind of models of meaning making that I'm trying to put forward here, and that is one of what has been described in terms of Kenneth White's work as an archipelago form, where we have lots of different ways of expressing poetry, essay, field notes, academic journal, whatever that might be, and lots of different languages and types of observation and method that we can use to deliver that. And so what you end up with is this kind of cluster of islands or cluster of different text types that are seen in the singular, but also as a whole, as a region, a mindscape, landscape. So again, this is the liminal ground, the crossing point, and that is the natural realm of transformation and transition, transformational elucidation. This next picture is a picture of Rowley Hills, and again, it looks out over the vistas of the Black Country, and you can see the housing estates and the blocks of flats in front. But this picture is taken right from on top of an enormous dolerite intrusion, which sticks out of Tiverdale and Netherton in the heart of the Black Country. And I just want to share very quickly before I close, I think, this idea that, you know, I'm by no means an expert in geology, although I've spent a couple of years sort of tagging along with the Black Country Geological Society and learning what I can. I'm still coming at this from a layperson's perspective. But I think that once we learn a little bit about the makeup of the land, in a geological sense, in a geographical sense, in a topographical sense, it becomes impossible to start to just see a hill or a grass verge or a housing estate or whatever. These become really carefully orchestrated and poetic things. And again, this learning of the things that shift and shape us, reawaken and reconfigure our alertness of the earth that's given us all life and culture and community. And so I'll close with that slide, I think, but I'll consider, maybe I'll share the other ones when we have our discussions. I don't want to run over my time, but just to say, all of these ideas are, and the poems themselves are from my current book, The Chain Coral Chorus, which is available from Playdead Press or through any of your, you can order it through independent bookshops. And it's a collection of poems, essays and field notes that are all kind of weaved together to explore the Black Country Geopark and this sort of animist idea that I'm trying to put forward. So without any further ado, I will close there and thank you for your indulgence and pass you over to someone who's been a significant influence on this book and my thinking. And I'm very, very pleased and proud to share a space with her today. It's Alyson Hallett.
There's a few questions there. Do we want to answer some of them? They're little technical things that people are answering, short questions in the chat. But what are locals or what are locales? I don't know whether you were saying locals or locales.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I probably was saying locale with the E on the end.
Yeah.
And by that, I mean one's immediate surroundings that they negotiate and navigate daily.
And then Gilles added something which is quite long and it's not got a question mark in it. So it's not a question, but it's talking about Zenetia, if that's correct. And it seems to be linking into this nomad idea, you know, the Stravega idea that is also key to Kenneth White's, and maybe we'll come back to that, the wandering rather than the fixed locale. And then Sukima in Glasgow Water Centre, Psychogeography, Geopoetics, connecting with flaneuring. I don't know if you know that word, Rob. I didn't know that word.
Yeah, I mean, I would say psychogeography is a direct result of the earlier flaneurs, and there's a trajectory that goes right back to the wanderings of the Romantics, like John Clare, who walked out of his understanding of the locale and walked into an understanding of his landscape, and also connections with pilgrimage as well. So I would say the kind of romantic early travel writers that were deeply connected with early geologists, and then into the kind of 19th century flaneurs. You know, they were borrowing from this same principles. And again, you know, and that links to Kenneth White's ideas of peregrination as a wandering act and a wayfinding act as well.
And Richard Roberts has asked us, what extent does place promote social construction of identity? You know, Scotland got many localities with historic trauma, and how does this state of affairs impose obligations on the creative writer? So maybe that's something we can come back to, but if you want to make a quick comment.
Yeah, it's very interesting actually, and there have been some really interesting studies done in environmental psychology on what happens to place identity when people find themselves in a position of trauma or upheaval. And what tends to happen is people double down on their attachment processes. They want to stay more, they want to feel more proud. And you see that in the Black Country as well. So again, you know, we've lost quite a lot of our industrial heritage, which is a big signifier of our identity. But post-industrial Black Country seems to be much more proud of its place and its history than it was when it was going on.
Great. So Wendy's comment is just said she loves your book, you know, so there you are, you got a fan out there. And
Thank you, Wendy.
Helen has also said, great, carefully orchestrated, even poetic terrain that you've shown. Great, Rob. So we'll come back with a general discussion, and you can read those comments yourself while Alyson. So we do bring in now Dr. Alyson Hallett. Alyson is a resident of Bath, but has also been in residence in various geology departments in my university, but also in Bristol University more lately. And I think of Alyson as the stone poet. So Alyson, it's over to you.
Hi. Thank you so much, Pat. Thanks, Rob, for that amazing talk and presentation. And thank you, Nori, for all the amazing work you do for the Centre for Geopoetics. I'm going to be talking mainly about the fellowship that I had at the University of Bristol in the Earth Sciences department, and showing quite a lot of images from an exhibition that I had there. So it was the first exhibition that I've had as a poet. But I'm going to begin with what I like to call my gratitudes. I open this talk with an acknowledgement of the lands, waters, creatures, plants, and people whose being is bound up with our own in mutual dependence. I honor the lives of those who have contributed so much to our human family and yet may be devalued and exploited. I thank the rocks and stones for giving us somewhere to live and for sharing their stories, wisdom, and intelligence with us. May these words set the conditions for actions of recognition, repair, and reciprocity. Beginning with recognition and gratitude, may our actions honor our relatedness. Okay, Pat, can you give me a thumbs up? Can you see that okay? Brilliant. So the title of my fellowship was Impact. I'll tell you why in a minute. So I began in November, and I was allocated a room at the very beginning. And this room was G21. This room ended up being incredibly significant for my whole time at the university. Here I am in G21. It was a bit of a vortex. I found that every time I came in here, I just disappeared. And hours and hours would go by with me having no recognition of time passing. So you can see that it's full of those nice day box files and books. And I discovered quite a way in that this had been the office of a geologist, Sir Steve Sparks, and he'd been made an emeritus professor and had moved down the corridor, but he'd left all of his books and materials in this room. And it was just this magic window while I was there, where I was able to kind of use his resources as part of my research. The pandemic, we were still having lockdowns when I was doing this fellowship. So I wanted to match up where people were and relate that to the geological things that I was looking at. You know, the question of trauma has already come up, and I felt that I was working in a time of trauma and that needed to be part of my research and my work. So the project Impact was based on a crater in Nordlingen in Germany. And this crater was believed for a long, long time to have been made by a volcano. And then they discovered that in the town, in the stones of the houses in the town, there were tiny, tiny diamonds. And of course, these couldn't have been made by a volcano. So they realized that the crater was made by a meteorite. And this became a site of interest. You know, how had they thought for so long that it was made by a volcano? And the volcanologists were working with meteorologists to discover what similarities there were, what differences there were. So this is the project that I came into. So I was looking at the impact of a meteorite, the impact of knowledge changing, the impact of the pandemic. And my main approach was through conversation. I spoke with a lot of scientists. I've written here incomprehension. There was so much I didn't understand. I think that's one of the things I love about going into a science department. And Pat, this happened, you know, as well when I was at Heriot-Watt. I'm just fascinated because there's a whole language, there's a whole texture of knowledge that is very new to me. The University of Bristol, in some ways, I found quite intimidating to begin with. It's when you go into the Great Hall, the ceiling is probably 30 or 40 meters high. And for me, there's always that slight trepidation of, you know, what am I going to be able to do here? But that was mixed with, you know, just pure pleasure of being left to get on with my work and to talk to people and to start learning a little bit about volcanoes and meteorites. So I'm mainly going to show you images from the exhibition, and I'll read a few things to you along the way. And I'm not going to give you huge details of all the scientific research I was doing, all the conversations. I want to just show you images from the exhibition. And then if you have other questions after, we can go into them then. So my exhibition, I'm going to read you a bit from a poem. In fact, I might even read you the whole poem. One of the people I worked with, Tim Elliott, worked with isotopes. And he showed me a thin section of rock, of meteorite rock, that was on loan from NASA. Tim shows me a thin section of meteorite on loan from NASA. It's the oldest thing on Earth, he says, older than Earth, old as in 4.567 billion years old. I hold the tiny thing and stare at it. I get on my knees in front of this, I say, here in this room, in the Earth Sciences department. We slip it under a microscope, and I swear there's a pattern that it looks like a stained glass window. Are gods meteors? Who knows, Tim says. A red thread shoots out of my heart, through my back through the human, animal, mineral families, then through the atmosphere and into the vastness of space. I say to Tim that I need to lie down in a cave for 7 days and 7 nights before I can begin to understand what any of this means. So you'll see here I had panels of text. on the wall. And most of these panels of text just contain short phrases or very short poems. So this was one of the ways in which I decided to display my poems. And you'll see that there's a red thread going between all of these panels. So I wanted that red thread to be there, to kind of show a pulse, the blood connection, the link, that kind of human mineral link and joining up. And I'll show you a few of the panels. Enclosed in the tender matrix of the room, we studied books and spoke with stones. And here you can see it with its little red thread. It was like a heartbeat as well, this red thread. And one of the places, I'm going to talk about some of my influences as well. So Cecilia Vicuña, and apologies that there is no accent on the N of her surname. I couldn't fathom out how to do this today. But an amazing Chilean artist and poet who works a lot with Indigenous practice and who looks at this red thread, the heartbeat, the blood, the pulse, the red thread of life. So I wanted to bring that red thread in, and the red was a motif throughout the whole exhibition in the text and on the walls. Life's a complex, queer archipelago of possibilities. I wanted to get the queerness in that I'm a queer poet, and I wanted to think about how we queer geopoetics. What does that mean? How do we tilt things? How do we kind of skew them in some way? We were joined up, well, the other people involved in the research were Leicester University, and I went to a wonderful seminar there where we looked at quite a lot of maps and mapping. So here's a map poem. Fieldcraft, make a map, any map, make a map of where you are, a vertical map, a horizontal map, make a map of here, a map of there, make a map of night, a map of day, make a map that might be a mismap. After all, we thought the Lake District was sedimentary before realizing it was volcanic. Mapping's a process, the mapper and the map in a swirl of mapping. I think sometimes with language, it's very easy for the noun to suggest that everything's fixed. A map, there it is, it's solid, but whatever the map is a map of is changing. So the moment it's made, the land has already shifted. So that's why I thought I quite like the idea of a mismap and this idea of a kind of swirl between the mapper and the map. So one thing I learned a lot in this department was about wrongness as a site of interest, where mistakes become new geopoetic portals, environments of possibility. So unfixing. And I think that's part of the role of a poet in a department is, you know, for there to be a bit of trouble, for there to be a bit of disturbance. And that goes both ways. So we can bring in new questions and find different ways of thinking. Interplanetary dust particles fall like snow. Breathe in, breathe out, compose. I talked a lot with someone who was looking at the formation of the moon. And this idea of the dust particles, right now, all of us are breathing interplanetary dust particles. So whatever we're making, these words I'm making, this attention you're giving, we're co-composing these moments with this interplanetary sphere. That's why I need to lie down in a dark cave for a long time, just to take things like this in. And one last one from the panel. Meteorites are miraculous things, the geoscientist says, the oldest things on the planet, containing the biggest clues to the formation of the galaxy, and available at very reasonable prices on eBay. And they are. You can get your little bit of meteorite on eBay. There's another little bit from Cecilia Vicuña. Wefts of incense sticks, maximum fragility against maximum power. Here's a poster I made. And I wanted to think about how I could use the language to show change and disruption. So I took one phrase and change something each time. The spacing, too many spaces, not enough spaces, a capital in the wrong place. And at the end, I had a spelling mistake. That felt really daring, you know, kind of tipping off the edge of language and what we understand to be its properness. So working into the materiality of language. I had cabinets with stones and quotes and poems. I made collaborative poems. And here I had, there was a postcard from Ana Mendieta, a Cuban artist who dug her silhouette, who molded her body into earth and made many images from that. Another artist I love. She said, my art is grounded on the belief in one universal energy, which runs through everything, from insect to man, from man to spectre, from spectre to plant, from plant to galaxy. And I wanted to work in a circle. I wanted there to be a circular poem. Everything travels in circles, is a circle. Planets, moons, life. I wanted to join everything up, the bone with the stone, the breath with the rock, no end and no beginning. And these are my great nieces, Dulcie and Verity, under the circle. And the thing with having an exhibition that really interested me with text is that it felt very embodied, because when you read the poems, when you look at the stones, you have to move around. So you're taking part in the space and you're seeing it at different heights. So there are different strata of work in the room. This was an exhibit of pumice. Oops, I pressed the button too soon. And initially there was just the label on the right, the white label. My label is the one on the left. And you'll see it says pumice and it says punga punga. I wanted to ask, what's the Maori word for pumice? I wanted to ask, what if English isn't the only language in the department? I wanted to ask, where is this stone from? I wanted to ask if the land it's from is stolen land. I wanted to ask what difference this might make. I wanted more than one tongue to speak. I wanted ethics to be a lens. I wanted every rock and stone seen through this lens. I wanted to let the old history sit next to the new history. I wanted discomfort. I wanted questions. I wanted more than one tongue to speak. And this is a big question for me working in any form of geology. Are the ethics at play here? Where are these stones from? How were they procured? Was the land they were brought from ceded? Or was it stolen land? There are so many questions that need to be asked, and vast repositories of stone waiting to be seen through these lenses. Have I got another few minutes? I've got a few more slides. Is that okay? I can't hear you, Pat. You'll need to unmute if you tell
No,
me.
just a couple of minutes because we get some discussion. There's a few points coming in, but not too many. So you've got a couple of minutes.
All right, I'll go as quickly as I can. So I wanted to just mention Pauline Oliveros with quantum listening. And one of the things that Pat, I think you need to mute again. One of the things I started doing was listening to stones. I started conducting experiments in listening to the stone. And I'll read this science poem because I found it quite brutal what was going on with some of the rocks. And I wanted to apply this to the poem, polish the poem, erode it, take a thin section and slide it under a microscope, smash the poem with a hammer, dissolve it in acid, hurl photons at it, grind the poem to dust and insert it in a mass spectrometer, fire lasers at the poem, place the poem in a glass cabinet and give it a label. Only handle the poem when wearing plastic gloves, archive the poem in a wooden box and put it in the basement. So these are all the things that are done to stones. And I thought, God, what if you did it to a poem? So like I say, I started making experiments with listening to the poem, resisting interrogation, and opening up that in-between space. Following on from that, I ran a workshop, and I know there are some people here tonight who are in that workshop. Mark and Paul, you may see yourselves here. So we started making experiments together, listening to stones. And Nori, this is what I will also hope to do at the conference in July, is carry on this work, really meeting the stones in a different way. That was a poem I made with a scientist, and I've taken the exhibition down now. So I just wanted to show this. This was another poem I'd had on the wall. And I love the idea of it eroding. At the end, here we have language eroding on the wall as it comes away from the wall. Here's a list of some of my books. Tilted Ground, which came out of the residency I did with Pat at Heriot Watt. And if anybody's interested in a copy of that, if they get in touch with Pat, maybe you could put a contact in the chat, Pat. Here, there's a few other books here. I'm open to make more exhibitions. The big print of The Impact is for sale. So there's just a few books. Oh, and Nori, you asked me to mention Geopoetics in England. So we had a trip last year to Helpston, which is where John Clare's cottage is, and poems and images from that trip are in Stravage magazine. And again, I think we can maybe have a link in the chat box to that. Pat's going to talk about Purbeck in June. I think that's the end. I thought I'd just show you that at the end. That's a stone that I've got somewhere else altogether from a collaboration with a sculptor, just spreading the love. So thank you for your attention and for listening.
Thanks, Alyson. Yes, I can always imagine you going into a geology department and doing some wrongness and causing some ripples, you know, so mild ripples, but you always have a big impact. So I thought that was a very appropriate title for your whole exhibition. I'm sorry I didn't get down to see it, and I'm sure other people feel the same way. There wasn't many questions coming in directly to you, so there was a bit of discussion going on. They'd like your science poems. There was a bit of discussion going on about following up on the previous discussion about whether there were, Gordon Peters talked about whether we could open up geopoetics to people who are displaced, you know, and people that come from other places. There was also, Bill Eddy put a definition of flaneur in there for us with some references. And yes, I thought Robert Duncan's comment about the complex queer archipelago that Rob was talking about is a bit like your red threads, you know, your red threads to link your islands of things together. So there was, I felt that was quite nice. And of course, making maps. I mean, Kenneth White was always on about the topography and the cartography of these wanderings. So we are all, Paul, welcome. We are all migrant stones seeking our place. That's a poetic comment. And Alyson, Gordon's had to run off. So I don't know if there's any other points out there. Otherwise, I'll hand over to Rob to maybe ask you a question and get a discussion going. And I'll monitor the comments that come in to see if there's anything else to throw into the mix. So Rob, would you like to come and respond to Alyson?
Yeah, I'd love to. That'd be great. I really enjoyed that talk, Alyson. That was wonderful. Thank you. And like I said, I make use of quite a lot of your ideas, I suppose, especially the thoughts that you have in Stone Talks, in particular, in my book. There's a couple of things that I think we've probably got in common, and more than this kind of queer archipelago thing or this stew or web that we both kind of play with. But I'm interested to hear a little bit more of your thoughts on your ideas that you put down about the body as a site of meaning, as a site of wisdom, and the way and how do we go, and the second point to that is, how do we go about listening to the rocks in that way? Because I think there's something there that meets with my crossing points in some way. Not my crossing points, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I loved what you were saying about crossing points. Body is a site of meaning. I mean, how do we? I mean, we can't do anything without the body.
But we're taught not to trust it in the same way that we're taught to trust our logical kind of thought patterns, aren't we? And I think there's
well, the logical thought patterns are also part of the body. So I mean, it's all part of the body. It's all kind of the minerals in us are related to the bigger body of Earth.
Mm.
You know, we are relations. We can't not be. You know, we've got calcium. We've got many minerals in us, and like I said, we have that interplanetary dust. I mean, I think partly training to listen, but I'm listening. I'm interested in what happens in that kind of. I mentioned an in-between space. So you know, say I'm holding a rock. Say I've got one here, got a lovely one with holes in it, and say I'm holding it, and I'm thinking of something, or I'm looking for an idea, and I have one. How do I ever know if I'd be able to have that idea if I hadn't been holding the rock? You know, and in that sense, you know, that collaboration, I mean, I'll never ever be able to find out, but I think we can learn to trust that more intuitive voice. And one of the things that really came up, I think, in the department is how you let different narratives sit alongside each other. So I think there's been, like you say, you know, there's been a dominance of what we would call the more rational and scientific narrative. And it's like, well, how do you let an intuitive narrative sit next to that, or a folk narrative? And you know, it came up earlier about the layers or the strata of trauma in landscape. So there's I saw an amazing Aboriginal poet years ago at Ledbury who had been called to a particular bend in a river to write, and it's where a massacre took place, and she literally felt that in her body before she was able to do any research and find out more about it. Ali Ebby Cockerman, I believe her name is. I'll find that for people if they want to know. So we need to trust that. And you know, when I talked about queering and tilting, I don't know, I just feel that's part of my work. And as a woman, you know, for me, there's always that historical sense of, you know, having women being burned as witches, you know, for our knowledge, for our thoughts. So that's there for me in everything I'm thinking and doing. And how we make repair, how we work with that. But what about you? How do you work with the body as a site of meaning?
I suppose I articulate it in a similar way to you, and there's a section in the book that tries to link some of these practices with ancient practices of animism and shamanism, but I'm trying to steer away from what Kenneth White lovingly calls shamantics, because I think it can get a little bit woo and can get a little bit new age and lose its footing in some sense. So I try and tread carefully with that, but there is something about there's something about the energy of particular places that are transferred through these minerals that you discuss in some sense, and that are transferred then into the minerals of us, and the neurological pathways that are built up of all of those things. You know, there's not computation necessarily there, but there is some kind of gestural communication, I think.
What does that mean?
I mean, in the way that you recognize a mood or a pattern of things by its feel, let's say. Gestural communication, in that we get an understanding of what a dance might be about, but we can't articulate it in a logical, rational articulation. So that's what I mean by a kind of gestural language. So, and I think that's what we get when we hold stones and when we sense the shifts of the earth. There's something.
There's a great book called The Living Stones by Ethel Cahoon, which has been republished quite recently, and she talks about, you know, the minerals in water. So we're drinking that water, you know, we're walking on these stones, and how that literally goes into our bodies. But she's done some amazing drawings as well of kind of people inside of stones, from things like the Merry Maidens in Cornwall and the old myths around people being frozen. But that's a really interesting book, The Living Stones.
Yeah, it's fascinating. And then I think when we start talking about this and relay it back to some of the ideas in environmental psychology, we can start to maybe think about this lay of the land, or at least this layer of the land, as being a very, very primal, elemental, perhaps even fundamental bedrock of the place identity, or the spirit of place, or however you want to phrase it. I mean, in the practice generally, I try and travel the same routes over and over again, so that I become over familiar and then start to notice things that I hadn't noticed before. And then within that, I'll also try and travel in kind of unorthodox ways, I suppose. And by that, I mean, sometimes I will run and sprint through the woods or through the local, because it piques the sympathetic nervous system, and I'm starting to focus in very different ways, so it alters my alertness in that way. And sometimes I've been known to kind of climb trees or do a lizard crawl through the woods, so that I'm shifting my awareness and shifting my sensory cognitions, and really, really embedding myself in the landscape and letting it run through me in that way. And it sounds silly and playful, and it is silly and playful, but it does something as well.
Yeah, I love that, seeing from the ground up. You just see in a very different way, don't you? The practice of Buto, Japanese dance form, but they have this thing where they talk about a frog's eye view, so that sense of being down very close to the earth, which again geologists are doing all the time.
Yeah, quite.
And looking in that way.
Geologists are also using drones more and more and more, so you get another view when you go away from, further out, not as far as, and of course they use satellite photography and imagery, all at different scales, but so we do look at things at different scales. But you're right, we talk about micro to macro, so geologists will go across all those scales. And I think Helen has said she's very interested with the queering stroke tilting. And I mean, it's interesting that your volume that you did for us is called Tilted Ground, and I know that you had quite a lot of backslash tilted in that. But so Helen's come up with this. So Helen, I don't know if you want to put any more comment in there on that, but I think you had a little discussion around that from the two. Excellent presentations from Norman. Interesting ways to think of place and poem from Linda out there. And stimulating discussion. Gilles also added something about Maori culture. The Maoris
really
probably
interesting.
Yeah, I mean they have the Mokapi boulders in New Zealand, South Island, which are beautiful round stones that they worship on they're not that size. They're the size of the cars sitting out in the road in front of me, but they're perfectly round. And they're
can I just say
crystals.
something back to that as well? What
Yeah.
she said there, that's really interesting about the when they're extracted, because I think extraction is such an important thing for us to be thinking about. And I know that there are some practices that happen now with geologists where they are talking with the people of the land before they take the stones. And I know in New Zealand in particular that there was an agreement at one point that some stones could be taken to be studied on the condition that they would then be returned, and that the knowledge gained from them will be shared with the people. Because, like I said, there are just so many repositories of stones that have been taken without thought around indigenous beliefs of what those stones might make, or like you said, Pat, sometimes they're worshipped. So there are so many questions that are waiting to be asked and worked with here. So that's really interesting, Gilles. Thanks for that.
Where else we've got listening to stones as well. I mean, we had a chat, remember, about the sonic properties of stones, and how a lot of glacial erratics end up being quite musical. We have these singing stones. I think there are singing stones in Scotland. There are singing stones in France. Stones that have had, you can actually tap them and they give off a musical note. And we had a chat about them. Some of the earliest glacial erratic boulders being part of a musical instrument. I think the Japanese or the Chinese even make musical instruments out of stones of different size to give you a different tone. So.
Yeah, and in Iceland. I mean, I wonder if Larry wants to say anything about geomancing. I don't know very much about geomancing.
Geomancing, a geomancer, is that Larry? Is that Sukima in Glasgow?
Yes, that's me in Glasgow. Yeah, I just have a friend who's a geomancer. Hi, Alyson.
Hi.
And you know, he would listen to stones, and there's some parallels I thought with what you guys have been talking about, what geomancers do. It also about divining, finding water, things like this as well, that geomancers are involved with. But it's a very ancient sort of practice, and it feels like it has parallels with geopoetics. Is what, yeah. And I don't know that much about it. I just a friend of mine was, that's what his job was, and he often would work with architects deciding where to build something and things like this.
Very interesting.
Yeah, and there's a comment there from somebody who looks like an X, like a crystal. Do crystals have energy that, and people, quartz, piezoelectric quartz, obviously quartz has energy because we use it in our timepieces and things. So, there are, if you try to twist quartz, you will end up with some energy. Does quartz heal? I don't know. I've never experienced it, but some people might have. So I think, certainly I walked past a shop in Edinburgh today where there was full of crystals in the window, and I'm sure people buy those for their healing properties. I was talking to a poet this afternoon who collected heart-shaped stones, and my comment was, why are stones, naturally, why are stones heart-shaped? There's a good question for a geologist. And we had a discussion about why, I couldn't think of any geological process why a stone should end up heart-shaped, and yet people pick them up on the beach. So there's a comment from Rebecca about moving house 7 times in 2 years because of rents in Edinburgh. Collection of 30 stones in the boot of my car that travels with them. I know them like friends. Yeah, lovely. Yeah, there are so many stones.
A show of hands of mutual stone collectors and movers.
Well, there's a lot of stones around
going up, I think.
Yeah.
Can I just say that brief something back to Larry, because I was really interested in what he said about the geomancer as well, and that thing of listening to the stones. And I really like what you said there, Rebecca, about you don't need to know. And I think that's almost my feeling with the listening to stones, is I'm just making experiments at the moment and not having any conclusions. That's what's interesting me at the moment, and doing more and more workshops with people around listening and, learning to listen to something and just seeing what happens, just building up a body of evidence, I think.
Yeah, I really like that about your work, Alyson, in that focus on kind of enjoying the incomprehensible. John Keats would have called it negative capability or negative capacity, I think.
Capability.
Negative capabilities, that which is able to be filled in some sense, so it needs to be empty.
But don't reach after any irritating fact or reason, but to stay in ability.
That's it
Stay in that not knowing.
So we have a little haiku about stone in the chat from Gilles. Rob, how do you respond? This is from Richard Roberts. How do you respond to hollowing out the land by mining? So there's big holes in the ground, how do you respond to the large hole that was left by mining there, wounding and depletion? Is it a vestment of meaning?
Yeah, it's a fraught discussion, really, isn't it? Because, in some sense, it's done a hell of a lot of good in terms of building communities and cultures that are rich with different outlooks and diversity and their own ways of doing things, their own art movements and musical movements, their own dialects and languages. And none of that would have happened if it hadn't been for these small knit communities of miners and steel workers and chain makers and things. So there's great things that have come out, and obviously that spread its wealth across the Western world at least. So it's done a hell of a lot of good, but at the same time, you can't ignore the sense of plundering from it.
No,
I mean,
certainly
there's a reason
geologists,
it's
every
called the
time we see a quarry, we go, we see meaning. I mean, that's how we find out what's going on underneath the ground.
yeah, quite.
A
There's
lot of
that too.
times.
So
Yeah.
people that have gone out after resources have inadvertently found sources.
Mm.
And actually, that allows me to put a plug for the event in Dorset, in Purbeck, because we are hosting that in the quarries. Purbeck is the source of all the medieval cathedral stones, even some that never got across to France and were sunken in the Bay of Poole Harbour. We have recently found medieval stones that never made it to the client, as it were. So we are hosting a 2-day weekend in Purbeck, and Norrie has offered to pay for the relatively modest cost for a 2.5 day session on the rocks in Purbeck in the 2nd and 4th of June. And details you can find in the stuff that was circulated. So that's a Geopoetics meeting to a certain extent in England that will happen this year. Of course, we've got a poet there, Paul Heinlein, who's mostly the best known poet sort of in Dorset, and he was writing in the 70s before he knew what geopoetics was. So one of the things we have a challenge is mapping geopoetics, if you want to use that word, back onto people that were working prior to the start of the geopoetics. So I think that's an interesting concept as well. How do we, if you like, historically mine the record for geopoetic contributions?
Can I just add, Pat, that that weekend is on the
2nd and 4th of June.
Yeah, beginning of June. So it's not me personally who's subsidising it, it's the Scottish Centre for Geopoetics. Though that I wouldn't mind doing it myself, but
you have the purse strings, Norrie. So.
No, it's the treasurer that has them, Dave Francis. But anyway, everybody's agreed it's a good thing to get more people to go to that event there. And just to say on the quarries, again, another plug, if you like, the conference that we're going to have on the 1st and 2nd of July in Scotland, again on the Isle of Seal. The Seal Island Hall is right beside a huge quarry pool from the Slate Quarry there. So both, and we're looking for creative workshops, proposals for creative workshops and papers about related to geopoetics. So the title of the event is Creatively Expressing the Earth. Creatively Expressing the Earth. So I don't agree that these places, some people think they're ugly, quarries are ugly places, but actually where I'm living in Cullerpool, I see a quarry pool right in front of me every time I look out the window for breakfast. And that it really can be quite an inspiring environment in which to write poetry or be creative in lots of other ways. And you mentioned that, just to come back to Larry's point about water divining does really work. And you have to be sensitive and you have to have certain, I don't know whether it's something to do with the genes, but Birgit's grandfather, when he was a prisoner of war during the Second World War, he was kept on, I think it was in the former Yugoslavia, because he was very good at water divining, and they needed more sources of water. So he was, that was his role there, and before he came back to Germany. And Birgit is able to, she knows how to do water divining and can find things that are happening under the soil. So it does work. And I think it does relate very much to what we've been saying there about responding to the earth and listening to the earth and using all our senses in relation to the earth.
So Nick there in Toronto's got a stone that comforts him in his life, and I think we all have stones that we picked up and find comforting. So I think that point of view is expressed there in the chat, and also in favour of small quarries, or I mean large quarries that are active and not quite so, but wee quarries that are abandoned sometimes are very fond places. Swaddy Well quarry, as we found when we went to Helpston, Alyson, that quarry comes into the poetry of John Clare. So quarries are nothing new. We've been working in quarries and adoring quarries for a long time. It's just we use them sometimes for landfill, and then that becomes a problem, as they found in Swaddy Well. And that's all narrated in the Straveg 12 issue, if you are interested, where we talk about John Clare and quarrying and mining.
There's a lot
I
of
don't know,
very,
Michelle,
very
do you want to
beautiful
put something
quarries
in the
Black Country as well?
Sorry?
In the Black Country Geopark, there's a lot of really, really lovely quarries as well that are sort of tucked away in these little woods. It's like sort of tripping up onto a kind of lunar landscape or something sometimes. It's really wonderful.
Yeah, well, that's how they use them in the TV sets that you
Yeah,
want
of course.
Doctor Who. Doctor Who was filmed in our quarries as kids, so hey, I love the way you managed to get pig iron and fire clay and ironstone in a poem, Rob, so very geological terms.
Thank you, Pat.
Marcel, do you want to put in a little plug for the Welsh discussion next up? If Marcel's still out there. Well, I have to find the details for Marcel's event, because Marcel is going to be talking about Geopoetics in Wales. That's our next online event on the 25th of May with Marcel and Hywel Griffiths. And the two of those we went to some lead mines in North Wales, and we've written that all up for whether it's Straveg 13 or Straveg 14, but you'll see a discussion in there, some creative work, some poetry, and some geoscience all together in the lead mines of North Wales. So it's lovely to combine geoscience and poetry and try to create something, which obviously is what we're going to be trying to do in Purbeck, is to create, Hardy created in Purbeck. Lots of people have created in Purbeck in the past, but we want to create some new work, bringing people together and creating new work. I think that's what we want to see from the English activity. I don't know if Alyson and Rob want to comment on what the English Geopoetics might look to be doing.
I was just going to respond to something in the chat with listening. I don't think for me, listening is such a big part of writing. Whether it's listening to scientists, listening to the land. And again, I think that's a training. I do quite a lot of body work. Did some amazing stuff with there's a great body work dancer called Sandra Reeve. You also asked about dancing with stones. So often when I'm in a place, I'll just do an improvised dance that helps me connect with a sense of place and space, just to get a feeling for what's there, to begin making an improvisation through movement. And, Rob, like you were saying, I find that doing anything that grounds me more in my body opens me up to listening and being sensitive, I think, to the land. So thanks, Larry, for that. And what's happening in England? One of the things I have written down was we're just open to suggestions as well, because I think we're maybe aiming to do 1 or 2 things a year. And this year we've got your event, Pat, in Purbeck, but we're open to suggestions as well. I'm nourishing a little fancy of going to maybe to Robert Burns's house, but I realise that's not in England. That's over that's one of my little fantasies at the moment, is we can go there, because I've always wanted to go there.
Well, you're always welcome there.
Yeah, but you're not claiming Robbie Burns for England, that's for sure.
I wouldn't dare. I wouldn't
No,
dare.
you wouldn't dare.
My goodness.
Yeah.
Charging over the border at you then.
I mean,
and Alyson knows that there's a group in under Helen Folkestone, who was Helen Nattrass, who was a contributor in the Earthlines book, and her poems are in there. She was trying to get funding to do a workshop type event in Folkestone, where we would look at the chalk. Somebody talked about chalk quarries and the flint quarries. Yes, absolutely Neolithic flint quarries. They've been going back. Flints are, yeah, as I say, without the chalk, there would be no flintstones. So, the chalk is a very, and we all have chalk water. In fact, those coccoliths, it's quite nice. Somebody mentions chalk there. Lawrence mentions chalk because the coccolithophore, that's the basic critter that makes up the thick chalks. Yeah. You have to amazed at how a microscopic or submicroscopic critter like that Rob showed makes up the White Cliffs of Dover.
That just blows my mind when I hear that. It just, I think that's when I hear these geological bits of information, I think this is really where poetry and geology work together so beautifully, because what you've just described for me is a description of a sublime experience. In a truly
collectively,
sense.
A bloom of coccolithopheres, when we see that, that's the only animal you can see from space. Collective herd, if you imagine a herd or a swarm. You can't see midges from space, you can't see herds of elephants from space, but you can see herds of coccoliths from space.
That's incredible. I love that.
In the White Cliffs, you mean, Pat?
No, in the water, in the sea. You can see between the whole of the English Channel might be filled with coccolithospheres when they bloom.
Wow. Never heard of
that. You can find those images on the web, basically. So they often turn up in the papers. You see this white, the sea's going white. So
do they make chalk?
Yeah, and then as they die, they make chalk.
Yeah, I was going to do a plug there for a book, Cornerstones. Don't know if you know that book, edited by Mark Smalley, if he's still out there. There was we did a series of essays on Radio 3. I did one on chalk and on the coccoliths, but it's a lovely anthology of essays, Cornerstones.
I'll put it on my Christmas list.
Yeah, and you must be able to listen to it again. Mark, if you're out there, you might want to say something about that.
Cornerstones, we call them coins in Dorset. The building stones that fit at the corner of buildings that are usually worked by man. They're called coins, not cornerstones, but.
Thank you, Alyson and Rob. It's Mark here in Bristol, and
Mark.
Thank you so much for that heads up, Alyson, and fascinating discussion. And I'm loving people's sharings in the chat. By the way, very, very rich. And Cornerstones is a rare thing because it began as radio, in other words, spoken word. Which is where the best things start, around the hearth and the fire, where all storytelling began, and for it then to find its way published by Little Toller in 2018. But that's not just plugging, something. It was an honour to work with you, Alyson, and Alan Garner, and other fine contemporary writers, commissioning each of them to write into a particular stone. And of course, there's masses of hydrocarbons in there. Climate change is in there because it's unavoidable. And that work continues. But thank you all so much. I'll leave it there. But it's been a joy to tune into this. Thank you.
You mentioned there, Mark, Little Taller, the bookshop, which is published, the publisher and bookshop, I think, published the young fella's, what's his name? Two books by McAnulty.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. Yes. The young man who's autistic and but now studying at Cambridge, I think, and that was an extraordinary commission. you know, as a teenager, writing into nature in the way that he did, and he's now at university. And I was lucky enough earlier on in my radio career to work with Common Ground, who since the 1980s were commissioning really amazing artworks. Thanks, Alyson. Diary of the Young Naturalist. That's
Dara,
it.
yeah.
Yeah, that's it. And they do really good work, and in some way they've carried on the spirit of Common Ground. Angela King and Sue Clifford, who I hope are now happily in retirement in Dorset, indeed. So maybe they could be invited along on the 2nd and 4th of June.
Well, there's certainly Paul Hyland will be speaking. His books are published by Little Toller. So yeah, Little Toller is a well-known Dorset publisher. So and I think it's a publisher. Sarah Acton is the other, and she's just published a book on Chesil Beach, and I think that's also Little Toller. So Little Toller is definitely a publisher that should be on everybody's bookshelf who loves Dorset.
Yeah, and they've done a lot of good, you know, and Robert McFarlane and the Karine Polwart and others. They've raised the awareness hugely of the natural world and creative responses to it. So again, I think these are connections. Maybe in England, it would be worth Alyson and Rob getting in touch with Little Toller and seeing what might flow from that. Maybe well, they could do something at that weekend, Pat. I don't know.
Well, I contacted Little Toller. They gave me the contact of Paul Hyland. So
right,
you know, absolutely. So yeah, if we try to publish something following on from that weekend, then absolutely they would be in the front row.
Yeah, good.
So
good.
I see James Murray White's name's come up. Mark is saying that he reviewed Cornerstone's book for climate cultures. So there's a link. There's a lot of interesting links coming up in the chat. And Norrie, you will save that, right?
Absolutely, and we'll also once I've edited the recording, which is just usually taking out little bits and doing an intro and an outro on, so it can go on YouTube. But even probably tomorrow, the chat, I'll send a follow-up email to everyone who registered, and if all goes well, I'll include the chat in that so that you've got a copy of the chat yourselves. But you can actually save it as well before we end. You can save it
everybody
yourself.
Can save that.
Yeah. But
so there's a comment from X. I don't know who X is, but do stones and objects have feelings? You know, interesting stone. Dom stones store memories of the landscape. So do stones store memories of the landscape? I think. I thought Alyson's comment about having a thought around a stone, and if she didn't have the stone, would she have that thought? Is sort of like Schrodinger's stone, you know, not Schrodinger's cat, but Schrodinger's stone. You know, it's not an experiment one can understand. I don't think we can repeat that experiment, Alyson.
Yeah, I think in some sense as well, Pat, that with questions like this, it's in some sense they need reframing in a way, because, you know, stones carry memories in the sense that they carry the traces of things that happened before in the earth, and they carry traces of fossils and things like this for us. So that there's a memory aspect to it there, and there's a tracking aspect to it there. But I think this is where that crossing point idea comes in, because this is we can only talk about these things in as a mythological truth, perhaps. And I'm not saying that in any kind of derogatory way. I believe in a mythological truth, or a visceral truth, or an emotional truth. And somehow the language that we have at the moment, it doesn't do those questions justice.
Well, I remember every stone that I have ever had, and here's one at the age of 12 that I embedded in a piece of wood to make a paperweight. So, and I know exactly where that came from, Alyson, and maybe I will take it back, but it's a paperweight now. So Pavlovia we would call that Pavlovia rotunda. It's a very rotund ammonite.
I wanted to say as well, with the stones having feelings, there's a wonderful book called Vibrant Matter by Jane Bennett. That's very interesting. And I think for me, it's just good to be asking these questions, and not necessarily reaching for answers. And there's a wonderful poem by Rumi, Jalaluddin Rumi, the Persian poet, where he talks about the migration of intelligence. He talks about the migration of intelligence or intelligences from the mineral kingdom to the plant kingdom to the animal kingdom. And I love that idea. It feels terribly generous to think that intelligence migrates and intelligences migrate. And I think it's where as humans, for me anyway, sometimes it's like, well, why would I be the only intelligence? Why would we have ever dreamed that up, or the only sentience? And you know, it's in a way the rocks gave birth to us. They came before us, and we would not have anywhere to be if it were not for them.
But are we not imposing our interpretation of intelligence, rather than the rock's interpretation of intelligence? I'm not sure.
Yeah, that's it. And I wonder whether that's then linked back to this idea of gestural communication, rather than the type of communication that we're doing right now.
Yeah, and then we translate.
Yeah,
that's the thing with the body as well, isn't it? If you feel something or whatever, then we're in a process of translation to try and bring it into language.
Yeah, and I like this because it gets back to that fundamental point. If geopoetics is about expressing the earth, then how do we go about doing that?
Yeah.
And Brian Whaley's made the comment that geological processes are stored. So on a sand grain, if you look at a scanning electron microscope is SEM, if you look on a sand grain that's been rounded in the desert, it records that. So you can always tell a sand grain that has been blown around in the desert, no matter whether it was, this year's desert or 300 million years ago desert, but you can tell it records that it was in a desert. It records the impact of all the other tiny sand grains.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
There's lots of amazing geological stories that you get from a geologist. So some of them are debatable sometimes. They always say if you ask 3 geologists, you get 4 stories,
That's pretty good.
Mormon beaches. Brian, that's passed me by. I don't know what Mormon beaches are. Oh,
or on beaches.
or on beaches. Yeah, right. I was thinking Raised Beach, of course, that famous McDermott poem, Raised Beach, on Raised Beach, which is always, it's just a mishmash of geological terms, but it means things to people. But to a geologist, it doesn't really link to a raised beach. But anyway, that's another point.
Yeah.
The first line of that Rumi poem, have you got that again, Alyson?
No, I'm just got my book. I'm going to have a little look and see if I can find it.
I think it was Radio 3 this morning. They had a piece of music that was inspired by a Rumi poem. And
apparently he's everywhere. Apparently he's all over Instagram at the moment. Or people, well, he's not.
Yeah, I mean, it was in Radio 3 this morning. Rumi, poets are everywhere these days. So
well, that's a good sign.
They're more common than grains of sand.
Yeah, the whole question
that must be interpreted. There it is.
Yeah.
So that's Gilles saying that grains of sand spread by winds are different from the shape of them carried by water. Yeah, I would agree with Brian on that one.
We're running a bit short on time, but Becky in Cape Cod, are you still with us? Because the question of movement and
Yes.
the physical side of geopoetics, you may have something to say, and you're going to give a workshop on this at the SEAL conference in the 1st and 2nd of July, a creative workshop. Do you want to say a little bit about that? And you're also going to give a talk later in the year, October, end of October.
Yeah. Well, I came to understand a kinship language with nature is what some of you have been mentioning, Rob, for instance, the gestural language, and also Alyson, that the gestural language in humans begins in utero with movement and sound. And it's actually, if you look at that closely, you see that it's all perceptual metaphor. And perceptual metaphor is a foundation for art making. So that our natural language, and the one we have in kinship with nature, is aesthetically organized. And it's become a very secondary in modern civilization, the aesthetic understanding of things and making sense of things. So as originally a dancer, I work with movement and sound in teaching this, very consciously teaching and deliberately teaching this language to participants. And then we immerse in nature. I connect that directly with nature and indigenous ways of making sense of things. We immerse ourselves in nature with this body of practice of this perceptual metaphor. And from that, we make poems and we make movement and we make a ceremony of thanksgiving and kinship with nature is what we do.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you.
Well, that's a good plug for a later meeting. So what date is that again, Norrie or Rebecca?
Well,
End of October, last Thursday in October.
Okay, into October, Rebecca. Well, we look forward to that.
The 26th of October, Thursday the 26th of October, along with Patrick Curry, who's the author of a book just out called Art and Enchantment. So that should be a very interesting virtual conversation at the end of October. But we're very fortunate in that Becky's going to be here in Scotland in late June and early July, and will offer a workshop in what she's been speaking about there, the language of geopoetics in terms of movement.
Great. Norrie, are there any other things that you want to advertise to the audience?
No,
or draw attention?
I had a wee note. Give me a sec.
We've done the Wales, the 5th, is it the 5th of May? So we've
Yeah.
done
25th of May.
25th of May. So we've got that. And Purbeck on the
Geopoetics
2nd,
in
4th of
Wales.
June.
Yeah.
And Seal Island in July, beginning of.
Yeah. And the only thing about the July SEAL conferences, so far, we don't have enough offers of putting on creative workshops or talks for it to run. So I've given everyone a deadline of the Tuesday after Easter, the 11th of April, to get your proposals in. And if we don't have enough, we won't have enough of a program to run it, certainly for 2 days. So
that link was to info@Geopoetics. I mean, the email address that you put
Yeah.
on that, did that come through? I said something in. Did that come through to you?
Yeah, they do. They usually do come through to me, and that's the website address for. And but you can also email directly to me at either of the two addresses: nbissel@btinternet.com or normanbissel@btinternet.com. So either way, it should come in, and we need a few more before we can run that. And but it was a huge success the last time we ran it at Seal Hall. It's very suitable for the purposes, and it will all be based around that area this time. There won't be traveling by minibus and thing involved. It'll simply be around this Slate Conservation Village and the Isle of Easdale, which is just across the water.
I think the only crossing you have to do, Rob, would be to cross in the Atlantic, across the Atlantic Bridge. Is that right?
That's correct. Yeah.
And Gilles got an event on the 31st of August that we should flag on the way of haiku and geopoetics, and the Seashores Haiku Journal with its editor Gilles. So Gilles and you, Norrie, if that's correct, are doing an event on the 31st of August.
Yep, absolutely.
That's online.
Yes.
Online, yes.
Yeah. All these dates are in the Geopoetics news, which I send out before every virtual conversation. So if you haven't subscribed, please do with your email address, because then you'll get the full list of these future events that are in the Geopoetics news. But I'll send them out anyway in the follow-up, probably tomorrow or Saturday at the latest.
So can I just, behalf of all the comments in there, say thanks very much to the presenters, Dr. Alyson Hallett and Dr. Rob Francis, for their stimulating and thought-provoking discussions, which hopefully will go on in one's own houses following on this discussion, your own quarries, your own outcrops, your own landscapes. Okay,
Yeah.
so I think we can finish the recording, Norrie, and unless anybody wants to add anything in. Brilliant event. Well, that's nice. Thank you, Claire.
Yeah, good comments coming in.
Yeah.
Just a big thank you to everybody for coming along and sharing and listening. Thanks to you, Pat. Norrie, massive thanks, Rob. Yeah, just, yeah.
Yep, echoing that as well in the quarry.
Not
Okay.
underground, Rob. Not underground, hopefully. Yeah.
Your diversity, you're my beating heart of home. A place without pretension that lingers long inside, to be champions and